This documentary is about to piss off so many people. Driven to contain threats to social order, American policing has exploded in scope and scale over hundreds of years. Now, it can be described by one word: power. Netflix is dropping a documentary film that takes a look at police in the United States. Now, this covers the background, how the first departments were formed, and then why. Then also explores how the origins are still ingrained in today's policing and what they mean for our society. Now, it's going to be easy to dismiss this outright just as woke or anti-police, and there are certainly elements within the interviews and history that come across that way. But the info that's conveyed comes from scholars, current, former police officers, and then historians. I appreciate all the archival footage we get that helps to reinforce what's being presented. A lot is very old footage, from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, but then interspersed throughout are images and videos from the last 50 plus years. And a lot of that, it is devastating to watch. I mean, we're shown Rodney King beating, George Floyd, body cam footage where officers pull out their weapon when they are clearly not in any sort of danger, and even footage from my hometown of Sacramento, where it's on camera showing how officers were muting their body cams during the Stephon Clark killing. Now, these are terrible to watch, and depending on how familiar you are with some of them, they could dredge up all sorts of rage and disgust. Now, while a lot of the interviews are with people who lean more towards the thought that modern policing has dire issues, one interview was a little surprising to me. A Minneapolis suburb police chief gives ride-alongs to the filmmaker, taking them to locations where people had been shot or killed, sometimes by other officers and sometimes just from street violence. But I kind of expected to think that this officer would hedge more towards the idea that policing tactics are in drastic need of reform, because he himself is a black officer. But he held more toward the thin blue line. He was able to acknowledge there are issues, but not so quick to point a finger back at departments to place responsibility there. Now, the film uses some of its time to detail out the military to police pipeline, showing how this isn't some new phenomenon, but instead, it's pretty much how it's always been designed. Now, I found myself really engaged in the historical perspectives as they showcased how and why police were informed, what their initial roles were, what that meant for others, especially blacks and people of color, and then even white immigrants who were seen as less than. Now, I was also captivated by the scholars' insight using fact-based examples to detail out their stances. But for as enticing and intriguing as the storytelling content was, the production value and the technical aspects of this documentary, they were quite terrible. There are large portions where the screen just goes black. I mean, they're abrupt, and they might have meant to be served as transitions, but they were clunky and looked more like editing mistakes. And other times there would be voiceover over the blank screen. So was this on purpose, or was something omitted from the visuals? So many times the flow of the narrative was broken because of the distracting oddities within the presentation. And then we also have portions where the director provides voiceover commentary. For me, his voice and inflection, they just weren't doing it. It sounded like he was attempting a heartfelt but also slightly opinionated narrator type of stance. But what we get is timid, uneven, and unconfident in the delivery. And this reduced a lot of the scholarly authority that had been established through those interviews, weakening the entire project as it just continued to occur. And then this ends in the strangest way. It just stops. I mean, I was watching this with my wife, and we both thought maybe there was going to be another episode, that this wasn't a film, but a series instead. No good conclusion or wrap-ups provided, just a small narration, and then poof, it's done. Now, a lot of the time in documentaries, I expect them to be mainly unbiased, and if there is a point the story is attempting to deliver, it comes at the end. Sort of like an essay. All the rationale and supporting background is provided, and then once it gets towards the conclusion, that's when a firm stance is taken. Now for this, the majority of the film, it isn't unbiased, so we know the bent that this is taking. But the movie feels incomplete, like the conclusion to everything we just watched didn't even occur to the filmmakers to include. This was a very unsatisfactory and unsatisfying way to end. I was intrigued, still wishing for more perspectives on the subject though, and I'd love to have seen more interviews with police officers, even if I might greatly disagree with their beliefs. It would have balanced out the narrative more and provided a wider base for audiences to draw their own conclusions on what's best moving forward. So ultimately, while the information and insight is valuable, especially for any sort of reform or change conversations to occur, This documentary unfortunately works against itself through awkward technical executions, ineffective voiceovers, a seriously sudden ending, and the lack of opposing viewpoints. I think this had a lot of potential to create a narrative that is not only informative, but also persuasive. And while some of that may be present, its effectiveness is hampered through inconsistent storytelling. There's no sex or nudity, there is a ton of profanity, and then a lot of heinous violence. Now, as a reminder, I don't give couch ratings to documentaries, and it kills me to say this because of how important I think the actual conversation is, but it's really hard to recommend watching this. So have you seen any decent documentaries lately? I'd love to hear about what you watched in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.